Welcome to the Oracle by Polymarket. My name is Will Ward, and today we have what could be the most important podcast we've put out so far. It's a conversation with Matthew Pines, who's an absolute polymath. His background spans physics, philosophy, cybersecurity, war games, crisis simulations, and he's currently the director of the Bitcoin Policy Institute in DC. Oh, and on the side, he's an advisor for Skywatcher, which is a privately funded group seeking to make contact with UAPs, aka aliens. I asked Matthew about what his background in geopolitical simulations taught him about making good forecasts, how he sees things with the Bitcoin strategic reserve playing out, and what's going on with DOGE and the macroeconomy. Then in part 2, we just begin to scratch the surface of the UAP discussion. I asked Matthew about what his personal confidence intervals are for various UAP claims that are out there, how he evaluates evidence and news stories that are coming out from whistleblowers. We talk about how we can use prediction markets to forecast what's coming around the bend this year in UAP disclosure, and then a little bit about Skywatcher and what they plan to do if and when they make contact with UAPs. But before we begin, I have to remind you that nothing in the Oracle is financial, investment, legal, or any type of professional advice. Anything provided is for informational purposes only and not meant to be an endorsement of any type of activity or a particular market or product. Terms of service on polymarket.com prohibit U.S. persons and persons from certain other jurisdictions from using Polymarket to trade, although data and information is viewable globally. With that, here's my conversation with Matthew Pines. Like I said in my email to you, I think you may have been genetically engineered as the perfect guest for the Polymarket podcast because your work touches on so many different areas of markets that we have. So thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So the thing that made me think, I really got to talk to this guy is that you seem to have this knack for areas that are just around the corner. So like I'm from DC, you've worked in DC, and there's this thing where something is completely taboo until there's a crisis and then we're doing it. So like UBI and COVID, we're not talking about UBI. That's crazy. Suddenly COVID comes along and we're mailing out checks, right? Bitcoin was this crazy fringe thing, and then suddenly we have Bitcoiners in the White House. So you seem to be in these areas that are just around the corner, and that's important for Polymarket because you don't just make money in Polymarket, betting the things that are 98% and they pay off and you make 2%. Like you really make the big wins when you have a long shot that's out of consensus that has a massive payoff. So I want to just start off with, from all these elements that we've gone through in your background, especially the war games and forecasting stuff, what is it that has enabled you to be in these areas, to think differently and sort of see what's coming up around the bend?
Yeah, I think you framed it really well, at least sort of looking back. I'm not sure I went into my career planning any of this, right? It had been more of a winding road, and sort of whenever the different branches opened up, somehow stumbling down the path that got me here. I'd say it's a combination of kind of having this intellectual orientation from a very young age, where I was, a physics and philosophy nerd. And so I was interested in these more fundamental questions that were, at the frontier. And so the frontier of human knowledge is by definition somewhat fringe, maybe not culturally or socially fringe, but fringe in terms of you're constantly trying to test the limits of current knowledge. And so thinking about practicing theoretical physics or trying to answer questions about philosophy of mind, where I was really focused in my undergrad, and trying to think about whether I was going to pursue a PhD, it was always about how do we know what we know, what's the history of thought. And so that kind of grounded me in, a very, kind of somewhat rigorous analytic disposition and sort of training. And then I went into the national security field as a consultant, where it's, much more practical, kind of hard-nosed, hard-edged questions, but fundamentally the kinds of questions that I was helping the government answer were essentially these what-if questions. Like, what if these low-probability, high-consequence events manifest? Most for the government were bad scenarios, right? Like, what if we have a pandemic? What if we have, no typical natural disaster, hurricane, earthquake, solar flare? But what if we have, a crippling cyber attack or even all-out nuclear war? And so I helped the government evaluate its capabilities, its programs, its technologies to prepare for those things. And so that's, both a typical bureaucratic endeavor. You have to understand the different arms and legs of the U.S. government, including all these different levels of classification and secrecy, as well as, the kind of scenario planning and, this mixture of rigorous, semi-quantitative analytical forecasting or foresight and kind of an all too human gut check. What do politicians or senior bureaucrats care about? And what drives the sorts of what drives what is acceptable to enter into the frame to even become the subject of such a question, right? So there are certain questions that those sorts of what if questions that the government is safe to ask, like even the 1%, like all nuclear war. But the what if questions that I started thinking about were sort of outside of that frame. Like 5 years ago, I was thinking about the what if Bitcoin were to monetize to reach some meaningful fraction of gold. This is, not a question that the government had seriously asked or even thought was a question worth asking. But the reason why I got involved in more Bitcoin policy and sort of geopolitical analysis of these different scenarios is it became clear to me that this is not like a implausible scenario. Wasn't sure how to ascribe a probability to it, but it had reached a threshold where I felt that it had to be seriously asked, right? And so I have sort of adapted that kind of basic frame of trying to come up with these what if questions that I feel like are not properly priced in the bureaucratic mindset that is usually responding to either bureaucratic pressures or external pressures to bring up questions for serious analysis. Like bureaucracies respond usually to some trigger event. And in many cases, the government has identified these what ifs early on, and they task some group somewhere sitting inside the bowels of the CIA or the Pentagon to try to come up with a plan, and then they'll convene a semi-secret group or a secret group, and they'll write their reports, and they'll sit in a cabinet drawer. And I think those have been done for a lot of scenarios, but I think they haven't been done for a number of these emerging scenarios. And yeah, I've just been interested in seeing the rate of change in a number of these questions accelerate and take topics that were completely outside the Overton window, kind of on the fringes, right, of acceptable discourse, and move very quickly inside the Overton window, where now you have sort of the three that I have paid more attention to than most have been, and they've embarked on a similar trajectory, is Bitcoin, UAPs, and artificial general intelligence. That if you think about all three of those, they had somewhat niche fringe communities obsessed with the what if scenario in their respective domain. Like, what if Bitcoin becomes global money? What if AI emerges as an artificial general intelligence or even artificial superintelligence? And what if UAPs, UFOs, actually represent non-human technology? These were questions that were being asked by a pretty niche community of somewhat conspiracy-minded or obscure, blogs. And they had their own influencers, their own organizations, their own kind of in-group culture. But now, almost at the exact same time, all three of them have entered into not just the cultural zeitgeist in many ways, but the political discourse. And now you have senior leadership, you have congressional committees, you have national leaders having to seriously grapple with all three of those questions in various ways.
All right. So can we dig a little bit deeper on that? So is it like, okay, this is your job, you're coming into work and they're saying, hey, Matt, here's this thing that's a bit outside the window. Can you study that because that's what we do here? Or is it an information diet thing? Because, I mean, think back a few years ago and the UAP question was like Alex Jones. And now it's guys like you, people who are serious, people who have been working in the community who are coming out. So are you reading different things, like you're into the scientific journals, or how did you find primary information on the UAPs when it was still in this fringe world?
Yeah, except my disposition was always to kind of pay attention to these things, and maybe it's just my sort of happenstance. It's hard to understand my personal contingent journey here, but I can tell you, like, early on in the UAP story in particular, like in high school, I had read The Hunt for Zero Point, which was this book written by pretty mainstream aerospace defense journalist Nick Cook, who wrote kind of a exegesis of the secrecy around like our most advanced stealth fighter jets and other related programs. And the allegation was there was some secret breakthrough physics that the government was covering up for some breakthrough propulsion. And so I always assumed the whole UFO topic was basically a psychological operation to cover for conventional exotic all too human aerospace advances. And so I kind of dismissed it after that and then kind of went off and did my normal career. And then 2017, New York Times article came out, obviously, with those videos that are now famous. And that piqued my interest. It didn't, convince me of anything in particular. but it forced me to update my priors pretty significantly to now take a second look at this broader topic. And so then I started tracking it, from the official side after that, and I realized that they stood up this task force in 2019, this UAP task force, which is I kind of understood government bureaucracy, and I realized like there's certain indications of the government doing things that are that there's some structural driver of that.
There's something there.
Yeah, and I was okay. Well, what exactly could be driving that is was unclear. But then you started to see a pattern emerge from that UAP task force 2019 to 2021, and then there was introduction of official legislation in the National Defense Authorization Acts starting around that same time. FY21, FY22, FY23, you started to see more evocative, very specific language, very suggestive language being introduced and passed in the National Defense Authorization Act, which I was tracking for my normal job. And you see these provisions that, senior senators are introducing and getting pretty much, broad support and getting into law that say we want to essentially withhold funding from any unreported UAP-related special access programs. And I'm like, okay, well, they don't just did that for no reason. Like somebody told them there's unreported UAP special access programs. That's not dispositive evidence that they exist, but there's clearly some reason they did that. Yeah. And so I kind of went down this journey of constantly tracking the legislative dynamics. And then you had folks like Lou Elizondo and other individuals starting to come out and broach the public conversation, go on podcasts. And I was just a consumer of all that, I would say raw data and testimony and trying to stitch together a coherent picture. And then almost through my own just kind of personal network sort of happenstance, you develop a relationship with a few individuals that you have, you create, trust relationships with, and then they introduce you to other people. And I just find myself now stumbling down, this particular rabbit hole where I've now developed, pretty strong relationships with a wide number of individuals with, say, very direct information associated with the subject, and that just has only kind of accreted to my sort of updates over time, and yeah, so it's like a mix of curiosity and just kind of seeing these breadcrumbs, and then trying to discern what is an underlying trend that they might represent.
All right, we're sitting here in the office of Bitcoin Policy Institute, so let's start a little bit with Bitcoin, and then we can move sort of to the more UAP X-Files kind of stuff. So Bitcoin. The biggest question for me about Bitcoin is it the dog that caught the car? Because Bitcoin starts punk rock. We don't like fiat money. We're making our own money. We don't need the state. The state's inflating away our money. And now, flash forward, you're running a Bitcoin think tank in BC. We've got Bitcoiners in the White House. Bitcoin is now this mainstream thing. We're doing a Bitcoin reserve or something with Bitcoin. So what was that vibe shift? What happened there?
Yeah, I think this tension has been there at the very beginning of Bitcoin. You had Hal Finney, predicting $10 million Bitcoin. There's no scenario in which Bitcoin is worth $10 million a coin, and it's not effectively operating at the nation state level. And so, but it took a while for that kind of theoretical proposition to merge with the emerging culture of Bitcoin. And I think you've seen this evolve, and it's coming in, I think, a sharper relief now, this tension between Bitcoin as crypto anarchist, open source money, designed to provide permissionless cross-border censorship resistant payment systems, as well as access to a hard asset that can't be, debased or, easily seized by state authorities. So inherently like a non-state money. So what happens when a non-state money starts to intersect with and interact with the sovereign prerogatives of the most powerful country, in the world, the most powerful state in the world? And I think there was a lot of debates that were happening early on in Bitcoin's history about what would happen there, right? Would it be a hostile engagement? Would there be an inevitable confrontation? Or would this be a kind of a soft co-optation between the state and Bitcoin, depending on which one has the advantage or how the networks interpenetrate? Because you think about these things are ultimately like socio-technical networks are existing state institutions, and the associated financial and monetary institutions are fundamentally being challenged by, but also I think almost interposed with this emerging non-state financial and monetary and cultural network. And so I see these as like emerging, an emerging institution that's going up against an existing set of institutions. And there's some like historical analogies that, are somewhat useful, though they're like all analogies, they're imperfect. Is an analogy between the rise of Protestantism in Europe and the challenge that it posed to the Catholic Church. And you think about those as different institutions that had a different kind of socio-technical predicate. So the Catholic Church was the dominant sort of vertically integrated hierarchical control structure for the societies at the time. They controlled most of the political organizations. They had essentially a lock on a lot of the money system that was related to that. And so they had a pretty powerful incumbent position. And you had a new technology that emerged, the Gutenberg Bible, that allowed the say mass population to disintermediate the power of the vertically integrated control structure of the church, and allowed folks to sort of gain direct access to their deity, and engage in sort of peer-to-peer exchange of knowledge, information that didn't have to go through the bureaucracy of the church. And that was not like a insignificant sort of challenge to the structure, and so that resulted in wars. It resulted in a mass disruption to European history, and I think that that's a historical template. I'm not sure we're going to follow it exactly, but there's a lot of analogies between the nature of the internet and peer-to-peer cryptography as enabling a form of social interaction that has the potential to disintermediate the existing power structures. And so then the question is, does that inevitably lead to a conflict where one wins or one loses, or does it lead to the emergence of a syncretic novel institution that is like a mix of both? And I think that's unresolved. I think that's why I find Bitcoin in the present context so fascinating, is because we're seeing this play out in real time, this emerging novel sociocultural institution. Bitcoin has a culture, has a certain ethos, but it also has, just the basic monetary properties associated with it as an asset, and a global set of properties associated with as a network. And some of those properties are very attractive to existing institutions. Like BlackRock is making recommendations to its global clients, including sovereign wealth funds, that a 2 to 5% allocation makes sense. Treating Bitcoin as digital gold, essentially. And then there's aspects of Bitcoin, the network, which is this global permissionless payment system that challenges other aspects of the existing power structure in terms of, how do we ensure that this abides by our sanctions regime? How do we ensure that we have visibility over all these transactions? And Bitcoin, of course, is an open, transparent ledger. That's how it functions. So all the transactions are public, but they're pseudonymous, right? So you have to try to use heuristics to try to track and associate transactions on the blockchain. So I don't think we're at this point where we can sort of pick a branch of the future tree to like weight the distribution. But as a one empirical fact that I think the last 12 months has given us, that allows us to really kind of readjust maybe what your priorities would have been a year ago, is just how you could say porous, or how maybe effective our democracy is in responding to emerging political sort of forces, right? So Bitcoiners were, I think, by nature apolitical. I think if you asked most of them, they were not the most likely to vote as a cohort. They tend to be a bit more kind of checked out, and kind of weren't necessarily aligned to any existing political faction. And I think 2024 showed that they could show up, they could throw their capital around, and they could, maybe the argument could be made that they helped swing the 2024 election in favor of the Republicans. At least that's the perception, both by the Republicans and the Democrats, some of whom now have some chagrin at the stance that their party took. So this is a long-winded way of saying, in a democracy, right? Ultimately, it's if it's functioning, it's accountable to the public. And if you engage in politics and you can sway politicians to listen to you, this is ideally what you want if you're running an effective representative system. So the idea is that if you've got Bitcoin now held by a significant portion of the public and now has a stake in its future, they're going to elect politicians that protect it. And so this natural sort of opposition between the state And Bitcoin can be dissolved or diffused by having Bitcoiners be elected. And now they're in a position to, create an environment where the state isn't hostile to Bitcoin. But this is not like a clear-cut thing, because there's aspects of Bitcoin that will continue to challenge the national security state and its prerogatives. There's aspects of Bitcoin that will reinforce the state's prerogatives in some ways. There's aspects of the power structure in terms of international finance and capital pools that really like Bitcoin, that could align themselves with it. And there's aspects of Bitcoin that challenge the existing model. So I think this is a dynamic that will continue to play out, and it will become amplified as Bitcoin has like scaled, right? As fundamentally to first order, its dollar clearing price is what gives it this impact on the world. And it used to be, for most of Bitcoin's history, because it was relatively small, it was mostly exposed to and impacted by changes in the external environment. I think now we're seeing the first kind of threshold point where Bitcoin is now big enough, and the political capital and institutional interpenetration of Bitcoin has reached the sort of critical threshold where now it can have an impact on those other institutions. And it's not to say that it has the dominant impact, but it is now a new variable at play, not just at the international and not just at like the institutional level, but at the international level. Now you have national leaders, and national policymakers having to come up with a question, come up with the answers to the question: what is going to be our relationship to Bitcoin? The what ifs have to be asked now that they maybe wouldn't have been asked before.
Okay, so I went back and read some of your Bitcoin and national security papers that you were doing under Biden. And first of all, I'm curious, what was it like trying to sell those ideas to the Biden administration? Like, were you having meetings? What were they telling you? And then secondly, it seems like, I don't know exactly when this shift took place, but more recently you've been talking about Bitcoin plus stablecoins as sort of this combined U.S. monetary network that will go out and extend dollar dominance around the world and be good for U.S. interests in that way. And part of me is a bit skeptical on the Bitcoin part of that. So I totally get stablecoins. We're creating demand for U.S. debt and encouraging people in Lebanon or wherever to denominate in USD. That makes sense to me. But then Bitcoin strikes me as still kind of like the anti-state asset, right? Like I listen to a lot of Bitcoin podcasts, like I'm sure you do, and the idea is like, ditch your trash dollars and start denominating in Bitcoin because dollar is infinitely printable. So I'm struggling with how Bitcoin enhances dollar dominance.
Yeah, I guess to the first question, there wasn't a whole lot of, I'd say, receptivity to these arguments under the Biden administration. Although I think there were pockets of folks inside the national security apparatus that recognized that there were some structural fragilities associated with the present geoeconomic and monetary system. That aren't necessarily going to mean that there's going to be a breakdown next year, but these folks look at the in particular, say the results or the impact of the COVID lockdowns on the U.S. economy, and in particular the U.S. Treasury market, as exposing an inherent fragility that kind of creates a potential Achilles heel for our strategic power in the world, right? When China is aggressively trying to challenge the existing system, and we need to ensure that there's no weak points. And so there's folks inside the intelligence community that were looking at Bitcoin and trying to assess here, right, what are the potential opportunities or kind of mutual alignments between Bitcoin as a global money, as a harder asset that has interesting properties different than gold as a complement, but also maybe a marginal substitute for gold. And what are the geopolitical trade-offs associated with that, right? Obviously, our rivals have been accumulating gold and hand over fist since 2014 in particular. And so it wasn't so like a policy question, but it was more like an analytic question. So certainly it was not something that was elevated to the NSC or national leadership at that stage. But it was, I think I was just trying to seed these questions. I think I wrote that white paper pretty much before Biden took office. It was like an argument to take it seriously. And I think the major recommendation of that report, which was actually BPI's like first white paper, was to create, have the president instruct his national security officials to come up with a national Bitcoin strategy. Like, just, this is now a serious thing. there are potential risks as well as potential opportunities associated with it, and we should study them, right? It wasn't like we should go buy Bitcoin, right? It was we can no longer kind of ignore this thing. And I don't think they ignored it. I mean, Biden administration did come out with an executive order on digital assets. I would say that it was like marginally balanced more to like skepticism and hostility, and that was of course manifested in all these things we now see in terms of Operation Choke Point and a number of other initiatives that just made it not a very conducive atmosphere to try to expand Bitcoin and Bitcoin businesses in the United States over the last 4 years. But to your more object level question and the arguments now in terms of the intersection between Bitcoin and the dollar treasury system, and why Bitcoin, in my view, at least on the sort of near to medium term basis, because I always think in terms of time horizons and different scenarios, why I think there's a plausible scenario here where there's like a win-win-win between Bitcoin, the dollar system, and U.S. national security is fundamentally based on kind of two components. One is just the mechanical component of the current crypto market, which, could evolve, but I think, the next 5-10 years, it's going to remain something like this mechanism where Bitcoin is about 62% of the total crypto market, and about 95 to 99% of all the transactions in that are dollar denominated. And so just to first order, the overall size of the crypto market denominated in dollars is driven by the dollar clearing price or the dollar exchange price of Bitcoin. And if the medium of exchange in that market is crypto, like Eurodollars, essentially stablecoins, then there's a mechanical link between the price of Bitcoin and the amount of stablecoins in circulation, and therefore the global adoption of stablecoins, given that Bitcoin is a global asset.
So like the same way a barrel of oil is priced in dollars, like you want to keep Bitcoin priced in dollars.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. If it's a global commodity that is now essentially like oil is a global commodity, there's been a lot of geopolitics involved in ensuring that the trade of that global commodity remains denominated in dollars. We've done a lot of things to ensure that that remains the case. Here's an emerging global commodity. It's a synthetic commodity, a synthetic digital commodity. We have an interest in ensuring that such commodities remain exchanged for dollars. And then you have this other second order mechanical effect of expansion of stablecoin issuers, that are properly reserved and regulated, leads to expansion of demand for treasury securities, mostly on the short end.
All right, let's get to some markets, because like I think that's like one of the things that makes this unique, is because we can go and look at these things and say, what are the actual odds for this happening right now? So your organization is actively creating recommendations or helping to think through these issues. And I guess like the biggest Bitcoin issue now is Bitcoin Reserve. So we have this market, Bitcoin Reserve 2025. Right now, it's a 42% chance. That's the live odds right there, 42. And we can dive into the rules, but it's the U.S. will, if any point this year, holds Bitcoin in its reserves. So we can use that as like a starting point. There's this debate. Number one, should the U.S. back the dollar with Bitcoin? Number two, should the U.S. just hold its confiscated Bitcoin? Should it buy more Bitcoin? Should it have other crypto assets in this basket of reserves? Like, how do you think about those questions?
Yeah, and I don't want to be too pedantic here because, there is not like an official definition of the U.S. reserves, other than you would say either the foreign exchange accounts at the Treasury in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, or the different sort of foreign exchange accounts held at the Fed. So like the way I think about it, if I was going to translate this question, is will the U.S. government expand its official holdings of Bitcoin as an asset on some official balance sheet, right? Whether it's a new program created on the Exchange Stabilization Fund at the Treasury, whether they create, say, a special purpose vehicle that they use as the vehicle for like the sovereign wealth fund, and they purchase Bitcoin under that. I don't think the Fed anytime soon will officially buy or hold a Bitcoin. So for me, the question is, the government already has Bitcoin, right, from its different law enforcement and intelligence-related operations and seizures. And if you park that aside, the main question is the government going to officially buy net new Bitcoin, right, using its balance sheet and hold those assets. And so there's a lot of there's two main ways that wager could pay off. One more short term, but I'd say lower probability is an executive order. Those can happen relatively quickly. Doesn't require much of a vote, but there is existing authorities that the Treasury Secretary could use with approval from the president to take existing funds inside the Exchange Stabilization Fund and under the Gold Reserve Act, purchase essentially Bitcoin using a properly structured credit instrument. And so that's existing law, existing funds, about $40 billion of sort of net positive position in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, essentially held in 3-month T-bills. If the president wanted to, he could tell Treasury Secretary Bessent to do that tomorrow, right? So there's no legal restriction there. It's a political and a bureaucratic. Do they want to do that? And does the Treasury Department, feel like they have all their legal and operational bases covered? And there's folks there, I think, exploring that question. I think it's, like anything else, it's a highly unconventional and novel proposal. Like our job isn't to, lobby. It is to say this is legally possible, it's financially possible, and it's a matter of political will, given our arguments, whether you decide to do it. But again, it's an executive order, so whatever they could do under that authority could be revoked in 3.5 years, et cetera. Most of the more strategic level, and again, the max would be maybe a few tens of billions of dollars. So significant, but more on the level of sending a positive signal to the larger Bitcoin market, and making good on a sort of the rhetorical promise of establishing a significant position in Bitcoin as the U.S. government would anchor the president to his political rhetoric. But it wouldn't be the strategic game changer. Like $40 billion is not much compared to our $39 trillion national debt. And where it might be going. So then there's this more strategic argument on the congressional side related to the Bitcoin Act. Senator Lummis has introduced it, and she's trying to develop a sense of what her colleagues think, and doing a lot of education. And I think there it's it's pushing this rock up a particular hill. And I think it's such a novel idea. I don't think there's a lot of latent opposition to it, but I don't think there's a lot of latent immediate support for it. And the political context for this is that the digital asset industry more broadly has spent the past 4 years aggressively pushing kind of their two main legislative priorities, so market structure and stablecoins. And so there's a lot of political capital and sunk cost in those, and I think everyone wants to get those across the finish line, or at least get them through particular congressional sort of wickets to ensure that those get passed in this session of Congress. And I think there was a sense of reticence to give too much attention to this SBR, Strategic Bitcoin Reserve idea, at the risk that it might distract from those two other priorities. So if there is significant progress in the next few weeks on those other two, right, then people have confidence that their major priorities get out the gate. Then I think the SBR potentially gets more life, right? And I think they're coming out of the Digital Asset Subcommittee, where Senator Lummis is the chair. She has agenda setting power, and obviously she wants to respect her colleagues and the broader consensus on the order of priority here. But I think the SBR is a strategic priority for her, and she is going to push that over the course of the spring. And it's a lot of education. It's a lot of industry engagement. So it's hard to know, like, these are nonlinear step function changes that could happen as we kind of go through the spring and the summer. But I would say, if I was giving the odds here, I think it's less than a coin flip that you get an SBR passed. I think that's that would be I would be surprised if we end 2025 with that passed in law. But I think we have a lot of open field running before you run into major obstacles on that front. And I think there's other things that could occur sort of external to the domestic politics of Congress that could trigger a change in the political attitude, right? So if another major country announced significant Bitcoin acquisitions, that would change the sense of geopolitical competition. There are other moves that I think the administration intends to make on the sort of geoeconomic and monetary front this year. Scott Bessent has articulated this idea of a global economic reordering.
Mar-a-Lago
Accord, a monetary reset, Plaza 2.0. There's a lot sort of in the wind about once in a generation style shifts in the basic foundation of the global economic monetary system. And so there's a lot up for grabs right now in terms of potential remonetization of gold, new geopolitical and geoeconomic arrangements, that could fundamentally shift how we think about the distribution of power, who our traditional allies are, who's a rival and who isn't, what the relationship between U.S. and China in particular looks like. That's the dominant geoeconomic relationship, and the recycling of surpluses into treasury securities is a particular issue that, this gets to the core of what we're talking about, right? Like the last 50 years of the global economic system, sort of post 71, we've been essentially a treasury standard, right? Where the global surpluses have been recycled into U.S. assets, mostly U.S. treasury securities and our scarce real estate and equities. And that has resulted in a lot of advantages to the U.S. Like a lot of our equity markets have been lifted by that. We've become essentially the place everyone in the world wants to put their surpluses. But it has distorted our economy. It's distorted our political economy. So the fire sector has been the big winner there. Finance, insurance, real estate, and so we have a lot of winners on the coast, but it's led to essentially a structural excess strength in the dollar, and also led to a lot of offshoring of our manufacturing sector. So we've had the defense industrial base now reached a critical point where the Defense Department realizes that running this system is potentially opening up the U.S. to strategic defeat by China if we can't manufacture the critical inputs to our munitions and our ships, if we can't produce the mass that we need to effectively deter or win a conflict with China. Then it doesn't matter if we have NASDAQ at 30,000, we are effectively not a great power, or we're certainly not able to maintain our hegemonic position. So there's a recognition, and this was articulated even by J.D. Vance in Europe, that the sort of Washington consensus, which is sort of this view of kind of not just the neoliberal sort of geopolitical orientation, but the basic mechanism of the treasury as the global reserve asset, more so than the dollar as the global medium of exchange, is the thing they want to change. And so Stephen Moran, who's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, has explicitly described how they might do this. They might basically try to impose a user fee on treasury securities, or essentially make treasury securities less desirable. And then the only alternative, if you're an institutional investor or a sovereign reserve manager, if the U.S. government is saying, hey, we would rather you not invest your capital in treasury securities, or if you do, we're going to basically do it at the point of a gun, or use a lot of geopolitical leverage to force you to buy our treasury securities on terms that are favorable to us relative to you. So whether there's a series of strategic swaps or century bonds that can only be sort of repoed at the Fed at below market interest rates. The alternative is gold. So there's been a lot of capital flows into gold in the last few months. And gold's the old standby when, ultimately debt fiat systems are not meant to last forever without either a structural devaluation where somebody's getting rugged. And usually it's the poor and the weak that get forced to eat those losses. And then there's an elite bargaining that takes place, and they sort of reset the system at a level that's more sustainable. And gold is usually kind of the relief valve for those sorts of, once in 50 years sorts of moves. And so it seems like they're setting up for another version of that, where there's a big bargaining and there's a sense of who's going to eat those losses. But if you boil it down to, okay, we're essentially going to rug the treasury market, or we're going to force people that are holding treasury securities to eat losses, essentially a form of financial repression with capital controls, well, gold is likely going to win. But if you're thinking about this geopolitically, most of the U.S. rivals have been structurally accumulating gold for the past 10 years. China, Russia, Iran, even North Korea's got a lot of gold. India has a ton of gold. They're not necessarily a rival, but they're a balancing power. The Middle East has been massively importing gold. And you could look at this and say, okay, if we run that playbook again, and we sort of try to reset the global economic system on something like a mixture of I think what Zoltan Pozar called like a gilded Bretton Woods system, which is not going back to a gold standard, but essentially where gold is now remonetized as a global reserve asset, as a complement and a marginal substitute for treasury securities. Well, the marginal effect is to sort of advantage our rivals and our adversaries relative to us. And so the argument I've been making is, okay, you can do all of that. I'm not saying, if that's your plan, there's maybe some arguments for it, but it's a high wire act. But if the upshot is gold is now recentered in the global system, it's now remonetized, it can serve as this neutral reserve asset to sort of settle trade between East and West and help maybe rebalance some of these structural imbalances that have led to the decline of our manufacturing and industrial base. Okay. But if you do the Bitcoin play essentially alongside that, well, one, Bitcoin's starting from a much lower base, so you get a much higher effect on a relative basis to have Bitcoin monetize. And it's also maybe more efficient to serve as a global neutral reserve asset. You don't have to physically ship tons of gold. It's very expensive, very climate unfriendly, and also kind of insecure. Like the French sent warships to collect their gold back in the 70s. And it tends to be naturally centralized because its security costs and its audit costs, right? Like we're debating right now whether we trust the audits in Fort Knox. Whether I think the goal is likely there, but the fact that it's a question, illustrates the issue there. Like gold is a old standby, but again, it's designed for a 19th century style international economy, and we live in the 21st century. So you can make an argument that Bitcoin is a better version of gold to serve as that. Now it's more volatile because it hasn't saturated its total market value, so you wouldn't expect it to overnight replace gold as serving that function. But if it were to embark on a trajectory towards that end state, the United States would likely get advantage much more than their rivals, right? We hold a plurality of the mining hash rate. We probably have more Bitcoin than any other country, like held within our borders and our country and our citizens and our companies. So if essentially the world evolved on the margin towards digital gold relative to gold in this sort of global economic and monetary reordering that could be happening in the next 5 or 10 years, it would accrue more strategic advantage to the U.S.
Let me ask you this. So we have a bunch of markets on DOGE and how effective the DOGE cuts will be, how many employees will be cut from the federal workforce, and those tend to be like boom or bust scenarios. Like here you can see like under 50 billion, that's leading at 60%, but then there's a time when over 250 billion, sort of like a boom cut scenario was in the lead. And if you look at like the federal employees cut, it's similar, like the top and lower brackets are in the lead. And I've started to hear some rumblings on the Bitcoin podcast that I listen to about this like DOGE austerity agenda, right? And how that could be a threat to Bitcoin, because like the whole case for Bitcoin is government spending like a drunken sailor, printing money, debasing the currency. Bitcoin goes up as a result of that. But I think people are starting to really think, is this austerity agenda for real? And is it going to make our coins go down?
Well, yes, I think it's an interesting question because, like a bit of a cliche in the Bitcoin world has been the biggest threat to Bitcoin is, governments getting their act together. Right. That, if the governments woke up tomorrow and decided they were going to run balanced budgets, they weren't going to fight unnecessary wars, they were going to respect individual liberties, they're going to allow, people to, exchange without, overt, censorship, then like the fundamental use case of Bitcoin remains an interesting cypherpunk kind of open source, computer science project. Right. So that's kind of the basic case. If the government, were to fundamentally fix itself, then yeah, maybe Bitcoin isn't, the bullish case isn't as strong as it otherwise would be. But then you have to get into the empirics of this, right? Like how much of the DOGE efficiency gains are going to structurally change the fiscal path of the U.S. government, and not just the U.S. government, because it's not just the U.S. government issue. Like the entire world is in debt, and I wouldn't say I'm cynical here, but I think the math is the math, and our deficits we're running 7% of GDP right now in sort of peacetime, no recession deficit. And ironically, the main sources of GDP growth in the past 2 years have been essentially consumer spending and government spending. And consumer spending actually just this morning took a surprise leg down that was below expectations, and government spending looks like, if DOGE does what it wants to do, is going to go down. So the net effect of that will be to bring down GDP growth, and GDP growth right now is basically what's holding up the global economy. And so you could flirt with recession. And if you have a recession or anything like a recession, the sort of mechanical effect of that is deficits go up. And the experience of the last several recessions have been the fiscal deficits you have to run in a recession have been increasing each recession. So from like 4% to like 8% to like 12% effectively. And so the next one could be even more. And do we have the fiscal balance sheet to absorb, to push out other 12 to 16% of GDP in new debt creation without having the long end of the bond market freak out? So I think what this is really about is sending a signal, and they even said this explicitly, they want to bring the 10-year yield down, right? They want to ensure, because ultimately when people talk about consumer prices, or when people actually are just, you ask the surveys of consumer sentiment, they say things are too expensive, or what's the cost of living. If you actually price in the cost of debt, a 30-year mortgage or consumer, credit cards, that is a much more negative sort of input into people's perception of prices, right? Like the price of money is the most important price. It's even more important than the price of eggs. So I actually think DOGE is potentially flirting with fire if they actually try to cut too much, because if they really pull down fiscal spending before Besant has sort of done the geopolitical deals that they want to do, and before maybe they'd be able to sort of do the big deregulation push that they say they want to do to sort of unleash capital investment, then you could get, a real drag where the effect is essentially like an induced recession. People default on their credit cards, and whenever you have a decline in the liquidity conditions for new credit creation, typically that leads to a contraction in the money supply, and there's a direct correlation between the price of Bitcoin and the money supply, or the sort of elasticity of the credit supply. So you could see a bear market in Bitcoin in that scenario, like recessions. But usually what then you see in recessions is quickly government stimulus, and government stimulus is a massive expansion of the available credit supply and the money supply, and Bitcoin usually responds asymmetrically up, on the other side of that. So, there's a scenario here where DOGE goes too far too fast, and it creates a recession, creates a credit contraction, consumer sentiment falters, and people pull back on risk assets like Bitcoin. And then the, political response to that, especially going into the midterms, will be run everything turbo and assets have to moon. So I don't think DOGE will be the main determinant there. The more interesting thing that I've paid a lot of attention to, and you pointed it rightly out, is on the geopolitical side. Clearly there's a recognition that the U.S. is not willing, maybe not able, to perform its functions as a global security provider, right? And we want to sort of contract and clearly delimit the security zone that we are willing to underwrite using the taxpayers and our debt. And so we need to ensure that other allies and partners, erstwhile or not, burden share, quote unquote, that cost. And so there's a lot of bullying of Europe to take a larger share, threats and, cajoling of our Asian allies to do the same. And even inducements publicly now by Trump to Russia and China that we should, each agree to cut our defense spending by 50%. And then you had the Hegseth memo saying we should cut, or we should develop models to figure out how we could cut DOD's budget by 8% every year for the remainder of the term, which would be dramatic. That would be like an extinction level event for most defense contractors, right? Like you'd have $300 billion coming off the defense budget. That would be like extreme austerity. Now, the problem is like running austerity when you have, debt to GDP ratios well below 100% is feasible. It's politically hard. Someone's going to have to absorb losses. Running austerity programs when your debt to GDP ratio is above 100%, especially on like a public debt to GDP ratio, leads to a self-defeating crisis, because the marginal net unit of growth comes from fiscal spending. And if you don't provide that, then effectively you can't service your debts. And so this is the challenge, is ultimately the way governments get out of this jam is not through austerity. It's through imposed losses and devaluation. It's through financial repression, capital controls. It's taking existing pools of capital that are politically diffuse or not powerful and making them eat some amount of losses by controlled devaluation or, backdoor default, right? Like the 1971 was a default, right? Like a dollar was no longer good for gold anymore. And then we were going to do a devaluation in 1933. The various Fed Treasury Accords after World War II, where we basically subsumed the Fed under the Treasury and fixed the yield curve below the inflation rate. And then you had a spike in inflation that effectively devalued people's Treasury bonds, but also, relieved people of their debts. And you had essentially a de facto kind of jubilee in the economy. So this is all about who's going to eat the losses. And when the sovereigns get over indebted, they're much more fragile. And so in a geopolitically contested world, you need to, potentially do grand bargains with your geopolitical rivals who are themselves very fragile. Like China also has massive debts. But I think, this is their plan, is essentially to do a lot of dramatic moves. I also think there's a different domestic element here, which is Trump. A lot of the DOGE stuff is not, to first order about government efficiency. It's about undermining the political foundation of the factions that they want to destroy, right? And so, from the State Department, USAID, or other elements of the bureaucratic apparatus that have expanded over the last few years, they want to take their legs out, right? And so they want to, this essentially of different elite political factions undermining the power and the capital of their opposition. And I don't think that's a $1 trillion question. It's, but that's what the DOGE folks are probably there to do. But remains to be seen. I think Bitcoin, if I'm going to talk about Bitcoin price, right, like it's highly volatile, right? But if I were to just like not mid-curve this, I just look at, have a Bitcoin president, Bitcoin vice president, multiple Bitcoin cabinet secretaries. You have the political rhetoric that's all very pro-Bitcoin. You have a regulatory environment that's very pro-Bitcoin. You have now national leaders across the world thinking about Bitcoin. You have national sovereign wealth funds buying Bitcoin. You have institutions recommending Bitcoin to pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. So I think you're in a bull market, just like that's by definition a bull market. Now, in a bull market, I think in 2021 and 2017, there were 4, 5, 6 drawdowns of 20 to 40, even 55%, I think. So you could have panics and people, selling off in, that's usually how bull markets are characterized. So I think we're in this, Bitcoin will remain a volatile asset as people effectively price in the future uncertainty of Bitcoin, failing as a project or becoming global money. And those are scenarios that are so extreme, and so any marginal change in your probability associated with them leads to a massive present discounted valuation.
All right, let's get to the UAP stuff. So you gave a bit of this at the beginning, but like, seems like we live in this world where if you're interested in UFOs and aliens, there's a ton of information out there. If you're reading the New York Times or mainstream sort of legacy media, there have been enough breadcrumbs stripped out there. You have this video that came out, you have the Senate hearings, you have this world where, like you said, in bills, in official documents, they've alluded to these programs. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, people are just going about their daily lives as if it's not happening, or choosing to ignore it, or just not. No one has time in their day to listen to the 6-hour alien podcasts, like I do at night. So how would you, if you were to talk to someone skeptical, like a mainstream media reader, like give them like the syllabus, like what should they go, if they wanted to like dive into this, what are like the top 3 or 4 things that they would be able to get from like a mainstream reliable source that they would open their eyes a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you could probably ask ChatGPT, like, give me the top, official reports or government actions relevant to UAPs in the last 5 years, and it probably would give you a good answer. And my version of the answer would be, to start with the official things, right? So start with the FY 21 and 22 and 23 and 24 National Defense Authorization Acts that have culminated in the introduction and passage by the Senate of not in the actual law, but was passed by the Senate, of the UAP Disclosure Act. And so that is the most, you can read it, 64 pages of legislative text. It gives their findings and declarations at the beginning, like why does the Senate believe, including the Senate Intelligence Committee, which unanimously passed that amendment, why they think such an amendment of the UAP Disclosure Act is necessary. What did they find? What did they declare as being the basis for this bill, which set up a number of, would have set up a number of very significant things, and includes very specific definitions of technologies of unknown origin, non-human intelligence, which also related biological materials. And it's not dispositive. I wouldn't expect people to believe the existence of non-human intelligence by just reading a piece of legislation, but it's one of the more remarkable and significant pieces of legislative text I've ever read, and that was passed by the Senate, and it was only defeated in a conference committee by some backdoor shenanigans involving members of the House on the Intel Committee, to the dismay of the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and his bipartisan counterpart Senator Rounds, who were two co-sponsors of that bill, along with Senator Gillibrand, Senator Todd Young, Senator Martin Heinrich, and I think one other person, but they. This was a pretty clear political statement by them that they're unhappy with the nature of these programs that they allege have not been properly disclosed to them or elected officials in the U.S. government. So that's the most official. And then you can paint a larger picture of looking at official statements by the government in its various reports that they have been now required by Congress to write. So the UAP Disclosure Act, the UAP Task Force, the gentleman who led that task force is interviewed and has given a statement where he says, I have seen non-human craft and non-human bodies. So he was a senior intelligence official given this job to find out what has the U.S. government been up to on UAPs. And he's now stated for the record that, he has seen non-human craft and non-human bodies. And there's a number of other individuals with a lot of professional bona fides coming out and saying similar things. Now, could it be a massive psychological operation? Is this a matter of intimidating China? This is where you get into the weeds of what's really going on. But I think regardless of your views at that point, you have to just take a first assessment of the trajectory from 2017 to today. The level of official engagement and activity, offices being stood up, legislation being passed, more and more senior government officials coming out and saying, more and more explicit things on this topic. And you can't ignore it, right? You either have to believe there's some systematic multi-year psychological operation being conducted at a massive scale, which needs explanation and has to, be accounted for. Or there's or the core subject of those allegations is true. And I just think, again, to your point, most people are distracted, and until it lands on their front lawn, they're going to ignore it. But I don't think that's going to be sustainable for much longer.
So beyond these things that are in the media, at the beginning, you said you have gotten a lot of your information from direct contacts with people who have been involved in these programs or the Intel community projects that you were working on. Two-part question. Have you personally ever had any direct UAP contact? And secondly, when you talk to someone, and say someone comes up to you and says, hey, I was part of a crash retrieval team, I want to tell my story and work with you. What are the tells? What do you ask them to evaluate their story? What do you look for to gauge their credibility? Given everything that you know, what is the lens that you evaluate someone that just walks into your office, says, I've got some, I saw something?
Well, no, I've never encountered anything that I believe was a UAP or had any interactions with non-human intelligence, at least that I remember. That I guess that's the rub, right? So no, this is all kind of an analytic assessment of personal testimony, the structure of government programs, conversations about the nature of these activities, and then affirmation by a wide swath of folks with very serious positions in the executive and legislative branches and in private industry over a number of years that have confirmed for me the reality of these programs and the reality of these exotic technologies of unknown origin, that go into the rubric of sort of non-human intelligence, although the precise origin is still ambiguous. But then to your question of how do I adjudicate, claims by people, right? Most people, no one's walked into my office and said, hey, I worked on a UAP recovery program. Also, I'm not the person you would go to if you have that knowledge. Like, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to represent you as a whistleblower or whatever. So the people who I've been introduced that make such claims, I'm usually interacting with them after they've already gone through some massive amount of vetting by other institutions, whether it's the Intelligence Community Inspector General, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, associated national leadership, folks like, for example, David Grush, Lou Elizondo, and now Jacob Barber. So I'd say those are the three individuals with the most significant public reputations on this subject, as well as like Carl Nell, who has stated, he was a member of the UAP task force. He's stated now publicly very specific things like non-human intelligence is real. Non-human intelligence is interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's ongoing. And senior non-elected officials in the U.S. government are aware of that fact. So those are just his basic propositions that I also think are true. So how do you evaluate these statements? So just to take an example, right? Like David Grush, Jacob Barber, who I know personally, and just also for the record, I'm now a senior strategic advisor to Skywatcher, as you mentioned, which is an organization stood up and includes Jacob Barber to collect high fidelity data on UAP objects using the methods and skills that they acquired performing similar tasks in these legacy programs to observe and retrieve technologies of unknown origin, exotic materials. And so knowing who Jacob Barber is, was a key function of me getting involved professionally, like validating his bona fides, understanding just how significant of a person he is. And, you talk to a lot of people and you understand what his background really was and what he actually did for the U.S. government and the nature of his professional skills. And, you are always subject to being deceived, right? But I've come to a personal conclusion that he is who he says he is. He's done what he says he's done. And a wide swath of people in and out of the government in positions of responsibility confirm that. And so you get to that point, right, where in any other profession, right, you're networking and you're like, oh, I met someone at a happy hour and that person talks a good game. Do you sign a contract with them the next day? No, you ask around. Is this person reliable? Did they set up this business yesterday? Like, have they done similar work in the past? What was the reputation? That's how you do this in all these other contexts. This one, you just have a bit of a higher burden. And I think, some individuals that I've personally interacted with and decided to work with in a limited capacity, at least, have met that bar for me.
Yeah. Let's do this, because you've answered some of these before, but once you get into the YouTube world of, okay, here are the basic things, like if you confine yourself to what's been confirmed in the New York Times or the Senate committees and stuff, that's one level. But then once you start listening to Jake Barber, or you listen to these people, Lou Elizondo, people who have said that they have literally been in this world, you start to hear different claims that go much deeper. So like I've just made a list of them.
Yeah.
Can we just go through rapid fire, polymarket style? Give me like 0% complete bullshit to 100%. You are personally convinced of it. And if there's any piece of evidence or an interview or someone to talk to that you think people should check out to change their mind about this, can we do that?
Yeah.
Rapid fire. Yeah. All right. So extraterrestrials, UAPs, ultra-terrestrials are real and have visited Earth.
99%.
99. Okay. UAPs have disabled or interfered with U.S. nuclear weapons.
100%.
The government has classified fundamental aspects of physics.
95%.
U.S. government have recovered alien extraterrestrial crafts.
100%. Or 99% to be consistent, yeah.
The same for biologic material.
Yeah, I would say that one is, for me, slightly lower, but only marginally, because I've just confirmed the physical craft with a lot more people than the biological materials, although they kind of tend to go together, but maybe 97, 98%.
Humans have reverse engineered alien craft and built them.
This one is a struggle because reverse engineering, so I think it's very likely, I would say 80 to 90%, that we have derived technology that's non-public and applied that technology in our advanced, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and weapons platforms. But the derived technology may just be a pale imitation of the performance characteristics of the actual, anomalous vehicles, right? So if they're made of some metamaterial that we can't reproduce, but that close studies of the metamaterial give us inspiration to create really advanced cloaking, right? Well, would that be considered reverse engineering? Most people think of it as like, do we have our own alien anti-gravity spaceships when you say that? So it's more of like what sorts of performance capabilities have we been able to derive and then apply usefully? I think there definitely are a subset of capabilities that are not public that we have effectively applied as a result of studying these materials. And they would represent, I think, breakthroughs in various domains, maybe propulsion, material science, maybe even biology in some respects. But have we fully emulated and reproduced the capabilities of the non-human craft? I'm very skeptical of that. I would say, 1% of that. So like very high that we have some derived technology that we've applied, very low that we've, fully reverse engineered the craft.
Are there any technologies that we have in our day-to-day life that are derived from this reverse engineering that are just, normal, considered anyone would know about them technologies?
I don't think so. I mean, there's the famous allegations of The Day After Roswell, Philip Corso, and that whole book, which is subject to with a lot of controversies, made allegations that everything from fiber optics to certain circuits, integrated circuits that were the predicate of computers, a lot of this stuff kind of came out of the Roswell craft. I think that was mostly passage material, kind of disinformation. I'm not even sure he even put that in the book. And so I actually don't think a lot has diffused out into society. I mean, might be some things on the margin that people got hints from, or you're an engineer that was on the reverse engineering program for 10 years, and then you kind of have some thing that's bouncing around in your head, and then you go work at Bell Labs, or you work at some R&D center for an FFRDC or Sandia, and it helps you with some breakthrough in, say, quantum communications or photonics or different sort of materials design. But that's probably it. Like, ultimately, scientific discovery and technological innovation is a product of, small teams of people pushing the envelope, and sometimes inspiration comes, from a dream. Sometimes it comes just with a happenstance of a collision of ideas. And so certainly, right, like the fact that we've had, probably thousands of engineers over the years working on these programs who, end up working on other programs, they have that in their head. And so I don't know what's been inspired or what has sort of diffused out from that process, but I don't think there's been a direct kind of like secret technology transfer program to take secret alien tech and, turn it into some new thing.
Okay. Next one. Humans are able to summon UAP or invite them using psionic or psychic powers and then shoot them down with microwave weapons.
I am 50 to 60% on the former, and I'm probably 60 to 70% on the latter. I think
apply those two together, and yeah.
So in a sense, the psionics thing is, for me, is a lot of circumstantial and anecdotal data points that I find very compelling.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen enough, and in fact, Skywatcher exists to kind of help build more of a scientific evidence base where you have, something like controlled operational experiments where you bring those individuals out and you ask them to perform their particular activities, and then you have, very sensitive and very advanced multi-sensor arrays set up to capture, anomalous phenomenon, and you try to develop a correlation. Hey, did we see anomalous phenomenon objects that we can't assign to any conventional origin? One, and does the appearance of such phenomenon, statistically correlate in a way that we can derive, some good t-values or some good p-values and test statistics associated with the activities of the psionic assets. I don't think we've gotten to the point yet on that front that there is a causative link that has proven to me that that's true. But of course, I've heard that those have been core elements of the legacy program, so I can't dismiss it because it comes from the same general sources. Although I want to see more data on the electronic, what you call like machine calling, but also machine interference, right? We're using high-powered microwaves, other means of electromagnetic interference or signal propagation to interrogate, detect, and potentially disrupt some UAP craft of non-human or even human origin. That I think is more likely to be true, but again, I think the data is still pretty thin, but is in principle easier to collect, right? Like the function of psionic assets as somewhat hard to kind of grok is a non-deterministic thing. It's a human being, and they have their own particular abilities and protocols. Flipping a switch on a device is a bit more of an easy thing to do in the field. So I've heard more, and I think just practically speaking, I think they're more effective. But unfortunately, I think that's maybe something you don't want to be just messing around with and buzzing things out of the sky. But it's part of the Roswell lore that maybe one of the reasons why they crashed was there was some lightning storm combined with we turned on radar for the first time, and these craft didn't know we were going to do that.
Yeah.
Seems implausible to think about advanced craft being hit down by radar, but it seems like these craft are kind of one-time use, designed to kind of just perform various functions, and they're not actually coming from Alpha Centauri. They're coming from some local operating environments.
So then, how do we bet on this?
Oof, yeah. How do we make money from the alien disclosure?
Okay, so Polymarket. I want us to see us have many more markets on this, right?
Yeah,
but we've got one on extraterrestrials. Will the U.S. confirm that aliens exist in 25? And the rules on that are: will the president of the U.S., any member of the cabinet, or member of the Joint Chiefs, or any other federal agency definitively state that extraterrestrial life or technology exists by end of year?
Yeah.
So, for me, the way the whole disclosure thing has been unfolding this year is Trump's not going to come out and say they're real. It's maybe a document is released, maybe Representative Luna calls someone up and there's testimony from one of these people who are in a program. So number one, I'm curious what you think of those current odds. Right now it's 13% chance this year. And what are some milestones given the trajectory that we're on this year that you could imagine being clean, yes or no? Trump said this word, this bill was passed, things that people could actually take a firm probability position on.
Yes. I've actually given this some thought, and it's much harder than you would think. Because one, you're trying to specify clean definitions here. This bet says extraterrestrial life, and I think there's a 0% chance the U.S. government's going to say that this year, because there's no chance that they're going to reach a level of confidence in the origin of these anomalous technologies, even if they were to acknowledge the existence of non-human technologies. So maybe just the pedantic term of technologies of unknown origin that are not the result of any known means of human manufacture and not associated with a platform or capability in any known human organization, right? Of conventional human origin, right? Because you need to exclude a lot of other possible origins that range from cryptoterrestrial, right? Early human civilizations that have been lurking here, and Atlantean hypotheses. Interdimensional, not from another planet. They're from another degree of freedom associated with physical reality. They're, extraterrestrial. There's some future timeline or future present human timeline. So, you need to clarify the origin. And then you need to set out thresholds for what evidentiary standard and what official kind of declarative standard you would define as the trigger for such a bet, right? And so that could happen in two tracks, right? There could be a non-government disclosure where there's a sufficient accretion of scientific consensus as a result of the collection of high-fidelity, highly dispositive, extremely cross-checked data on the reality of non-human technologies with anomalous performance characteristics. So you correlate an object with multiple sensors doing crazy stuff. You retrieve that object. You study it. You say, this is made of some crazy metamaterials. It has these beings inside that are clearly not humans. And you get all the scientists and the academics together, and you study the performance data that you've observed, the materials, the biological materials, and you go, that's anomalous, that's anomalous, that's anomalous. This is clearly not of human origin. We agree. and it's a process of scientific scientific consensus and social sense making, right? There's no like binary flip, right? So it's kind of hard to bet on that, right? Unless you say, does Nature print a review article that confirms the existence of non-human origin technology? Don't think that would happen this year. With the government on the other side of the track, get to a point where they say appoint, like certain things you could bet, like would they appoint a UAP czar? Right. That's something that you could bet on. And what would be the official description of that UAP czar? Like, would it just try to dodge and talk about UFOs? I mean, talk about like drones, sort of New Jersey stuff, or would they explicitly say the question is to resolve the question of anomalous objects? Would the next Arrow report? You could have a bet on the contents of that Arrow report. Whether it would backtrack on some of the statements of the past report, which the new director of the Arrow, Koslowski, would indicate. You can make a wager on, for example, this upcoming documentary, Age of Disclosure, has like 30 some former national security officials. There's other people that have been interviewed for that documentary that are not in the trailer, whose names are not known, and so you could wager on what those people, who they are, and what they might say that are of sort of national significance. So will there be, cabinet level officials or former U.S. presidents, for example, stating, explicitly, UAP are a real phenomenon and they're unexplained and we don't believe that they're, foreign or U.S. origin, something like that. That could be a bet. I don't think the right bet is sort of, Trump going to the Rose Garden and saying the aliens are here. That I would say is 0% or very, very unlikely. The legislative thing also probably less likely. I think Senator Rounds is likely. On the other hand, he will he said he was going to reintroduce the UAP Disclosure Act this year. He's in the majority, so maybe it's got more life. And importantly, the HIPC on the House side, the main opposition to the UAP Disclosure Act in the previous Congress was Mike Turner. He's now bounced out of that job. So you could have a pretty good wager on the chances of the UAP Disclosure Act or some version of it being passed. So that would create this UAP Records Review Board. So there are certain very specific either legislative milestones, like the passage of the UAPDA or the establishment of a UAP czar inside the White House or inside the DNI. You could, try to look at the language around official government reports and whether that is going to change in some specific fashion. You could look at these private efforts like Skywatcher, for example, is, their main objective. And actually, this isn't public yet, but I think we intend to release like a white paper on levels of disclosure, right? So that we have different benchmarks. And it's like you start level 1, we have pure anecdote and rumor, basically, right? Like people's cell phone videos or accounts of anomalous experiences in the woods, which is basically the entire, history of UAPs up until now. And then you have allegations of, different government records and their provenance, whether they're true or not. Level 2 is you have more systematic investigation and data collection. And sort of investigation of anomalous reports, sort of compilation of data. Level 3 is you have serious scientific hypothesis generation and testing against that data. We have that scientific method that starts to be applied. Level 4, we would have peer review, right? You would do the analysis of the data. You would have your rigorous statistical checks, and then you would hand all those results over to an independent peer organization to basically poke holes in it, right? To do their own independent replication. That's how you get scientific consensus. And then level 5 essentially is the scientific and social sense making reaches a conclusion that the phenomenon observed is truly anomalous, and then it requires official, institutional recognition and action, both by academic, independent organizations and the government. And then level 6 would be the official government acknowledgement that the phenomena is truly anomalous, is not of conventional human origin, and we need to embark on official, government investigations. We need to fund research. We need to release all the information we know. So you could do that. You could bet on literally does Skywatcher get like an egg, right? But then the question is do you believe them? And I think ultimately, right, like even in the best case scenario, right, like say that it actually works, that this Skywatcher folks are able to retrieve an anomalous object. It's not impossible, right? If the mechanisms and the methods that are apparently, you know, uh, been developed for such a thing. Well, then I go through that hypothesis, like, well, then who would believe it, right? Okay, so say you film it in 4K.
That's the question I have. So say it works, the bet pays, you summon, you retrieve a craft. What's the plan? What are you releasing it? Like, are you putting out a report? Is there a trigger that's established?
Yeah, I mean, finally, this is about, it's almost like sending a deep sea expedition, right, to try to discover like a new life form in the Marianas Trench, right? And you go down there, it's high risk, no real chances you're actually going to get something in your trap. And say you get something in your trap and you got it on video. This like really weird blobby looking fish thing. And you show that video to a bunch of scientists. And some scientists will go, oh, that's interesting. Sometimes they'll be like, oh no, that's actually just a different version of this other fish. It's a normal fish. You just got it in a weird light, weird artifacts of the camera. We don't believe that's an anomalous fish. And so you go, okay, well, people that are curious, come study the fish and tell me, is this truly a new fish or not? And the scientists will go, oh, we'll have to do all these tests. We're going to have to do the samples, do the genetic analysis. We're going to have to look at all the literature to see, has this fish been discovered before? And that's the process of science before you take something that's like apparently anomalous and confirm that it's that it actually is new. I think that's the same thing. It's like you retrieve an apparently anomalous object. Well, one, who's going to believe that it isn't just styrofoam, some CGI, or some social media stunt? And so you're going to like bring people in, and people are going to have to believe it enough to take it seriously to like go to wherever you're holding it, and then bring their instruments and figure out how you're going to study it, and then how you even embark on a process of scientific analysis. I think it's uncharted territory here. Like I think the U.S. government will have an interest in ensuring that this doesn't become a big spectacle. So there's always a risk that the government just steps in. And even in the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023, it had a provision at the very end, which was an eminent domain provision, where basically the government reserved the right to take possession of any anomalous material, technology of unknown origin, in the hands of any private sector organization, any state and local government, etc. I think the motivation for that was the credible allegation that there are these materials in the custody of a bunch of private aerospace companies that are not under the official control of the U.S. government.
Will you have a canary on your website in case that happens?
Well, again, I'm not speaking for Skywatcher here. This is my own personal views. It's just, this isn't about control of just one object that you happen to get. Like by assumption, it isn't like all that hard, right? Like it's more about pushing the social conversation forward to take it seriously, right? And I think there are folks in the government that want that to happen as well, right? And that's they also look at the history of these programs and feel that is needs to change. The basic operating modalities and the level of secrecy needs to change associated with these activities for a lot of reasons: geopolitical reasons, technological competition, maybe some exogenous trends that they need to prepare for. And so there's a need. And so I view this as like building a bridge, and it's like government disclosure is one half of the bridge coming from one side of the river, but the government's kind of in a difficult position because they first need to establish accountability of these legacy programs that have been maybe rogue in some ways. Maybe there's some historical crimes that have been committed that people are worried about coming into the public sphere. And there's all these bureaucratic issues associated with the new administration and taking over these agencies and establishing their own control over these bureaucracies. So all that's happening at the same time that this like existential level question of of the reality of non-human intelligence is like looming over all of their heads. And it's almost like too much for any given official to do anything with, right? Like, it's Spider-Man GIF. Like, whose job is it to do this? And, Secretary of State pointing at the National Security Advisor, pointing at the DNI. It's like, I don't want to own this hot potato, guys. So I think having a bridge be built from civil society, private organizations that are doing it in an open, transparent fashion, where you are collecting data, you're sharing the data, you're getting independent folks to sort of bring their tools right to the table, and again take it seriously as an unknown to be investigated. And you have the normal process of science, right, to study the world. And if these are a phenomenon in the world, you don't necessarily just need that big daddy government to tell you it's true. Like, these are just facts about reality that, like, if you take them seriously, can go, try to validate. So I think you need to build the bridge from both sides, and ideally, meet in the middle, and then have, some people are going to be, you have a new bridge. Okay, who's the first person to goes walk across it, right? Usually you have to have a bit more, willingness to take risk or have trust in the people that build the bridge. But then you see enough people walk across the bridge, the rest of the people on either side of the river realize, I guess this is a real bridge. Maybe I can start using it. I think that's just the process that we're going to go through. So you can have a bet that's like that pays off like a discrete announcement. I think you have to be extremely specific in how you structure that. And that's interesting. I think it's more likely to hinge on the big disclosure question, which I think is more likely to be a process of social sense making and people's worldviews being updated in, different ways across the population. And then there are these like discrete bureaucratic movements, and then discrete milestones in the public discourse and the scientific discourse. Like, maybe you could have like the first article published in Nature that like uses the term non-human technology, right? Or something like that, right? Where there's some threshold that we haven't hit yet that you would expect to hit if this process is going to unfold. It wouldn't be the like, end all be all of quote disclosure, but it would be a significant marker along that path. And I think we're at the very, very early stages of that. And yeah, there's also a lot that's the government is in, I think I was to say this, like the canonical distribution of discussion points around this has either fallen into the catastrophic disclosure bucket or the controlled disclosure bucket. And depending on your disposition or your role, your inclination, you're like, we want to steer towards get everything out there all at once, have some big whistleblower with terabytes of data, just like dump it on 4chan and go ham. And then there's the controlled disclosure pieces, which is set up a review board, have a bunch of eminent scientists and historians and national security folks and diplomats and religious scholars and economists, get all the clearances, and they get all of the data records, and they decide to make recommendations to the president. Here's how you should disclose this information in a controlled fashion to minimize disruption and, ensure that this kind of can diffuse and be adapted to. And I think there's folks in the between that are, more realistic. Like I'm someone in between of just like projecting out what's actually likely going to happen. Is like more chaotic disclosure, right? Where it's probably not going to be totally catastrophic, but I just don't know that we have the bureaucratic, managerial, or political competence and like social attitude to like, I look at the Epstein thing as an example, right? It's like you have this very serious question of national security, of political corruption, potentially, traditional fodder for conspiracy theories, but there's a core of it that is like a real issue that needs to be addressed, and it's issue of secrecy, intelligence agencies, and elite power politics. But the way that serious issue, gets sort of refracted through the kaleidoscope of our social media and influencer attention economy is it tends to make it kind of a frivolous thing. It tends to make it look like a stunt. And I worry that we could go in a similar vein where you have the very serious substrata of this issue and very serious people start to, engage with it. But our funhouse mirror social media environment is just so distracted by the frivolity of attention seeking that it gets distorted and it becomes kind of a joke. So I don't know how we're going to exactly navigate this territory. And UAPs are particularly difficult for people to get a handle on it because it's not like any other topic of political or scientific discourse that people can sort of approach narrowly. Like by assumption, it affects everything, not just, our knowledge of physics, potential technology disruptions, when the associated impacts on our economic and geopolitical and, a civilizational, basis, but our sense of identity, our personal identity, our species identity, our role in the hierarchy of being, our religious views, our sense of the metaphysical basis of human consciousness. Like these are like huge questions that like most people are just not prepared to take like all at once.
Yeah.
And the government is certainly not the source of truth on most of those questions. We don't look to the government to answer most of those questions for us. Yeah. So we're in a difficult spot, I think.
Matt, you've been super generous with your time. I know you have to bounce to a meeting, but I just want to pick up on what you said, because I think certainly like Poly Market, we like to have fun. We have fun pop culture, clickbaity markets about whatever is popping off in this day. But there's also a serious side to it. And we, at our core, believe that these probabilistic judgments that come out of this betting side of the market actually give us insight into what's likely to happen, especially if the markets are created by someone like you or someone who knows kind of the ins and outs and knows. You kind of have to see what might be coming out in the next 6 months, what might be coming down the pike in the next year, be able to craft those markets in a way that actually elicits useful information. So I know we've just scratched the surface and you've got to go, but I hope we can continue this conversation and try to figure out the way to get even more granular and deep, especially on this UAP stuff.
Yeah, I think it's really important, one, like to catalyze attention and put real skin in the game on these questions, right? You have the constant back and forth on Reddit threads and Twitter, right? Like any new video or whistleblower comes out and it's just, the same basic back and forth, right? And this is what betting markets are for. People put skin in the game, and you can then use those as a real-time barometer of, is the conversation moving, folks that are willing to engage with the evidence and put their money where their cognition is. I think that's really important. So yeah, I think we're going to need more finely tuned bets here to like drive at the object level questions that I think are going to be relevant in the next year or so. And yeah, I think, getting liquidity around them and, motivating people to debate and forcing the odds in their favor is the right alignment of incentives. And yeah, I think ultimately this is where we're going to be heading, is these questions what started on the fringe are now coming into the fore, and a lot of folks, they can be financially rewarded for their open-mindedness. And so, hopefully we can help with that.
What is the best way for people to connect with you? Is it Twitter, X? And then secondly, like if there's any resource on this UAP stuff that you would want someone to look at next, a book, a podcast, where would you send people if they were sort of in this unaware to aware camp and they want to go to the next thing that will be a good resource that you think is valuable?
Yeah, so my Twitter account is just my name at Matthew_Pines. My organization I'm proud to now help lead as executive director is b2cpolicy.org. So if you're interested in Bitcoin, the intersection of Bitcoin and national and international policy, give us a shout if you want to engage with us. And then on the UAP side, there's some good light or like sort of entry level resources that folks have put together. I think like UAP in 15 minutes or UAP brief has a good sort of summary of a lot of legislative stuff, and the UAP Disclosure Fund has also kind of like a summary of the legislative actions and the different political statements. Askapol, he's a independent journalist, a really good on the ground. He's the guy that basically puts all the congressmen and senators on the record on UAPs, and so he's doing the shoe leather to like ask these folks what they think and get them to actually say some very interesting things. So follow Matt Laszlo, his journalism, as well as Christopher Sharp. He's an independent journalist in England who's got really good sources on this subject and is also a dogged investigative journalist and has written some really interesting pieces about these things. And he's careful with what he says. Ross Coulthart is a really good journalist who also has exceptional sources on this subject. And he is very diligent in how he reports only what he can confirm. He's written a book called In Plain Sight. Lou Elizondo's book, Imminent, is a good sort of autobiography. It gives you a certain vantage point on the recent history of the subject. I mean, there's a lot of kind of books that kind of can give you a lot of the UAP lore. It depends on how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. Read the UAP Disclosure Act, just primary source materials, and there's some, I'd say, high quality podcasts out there that are not sensationalists. They're not pushing, I think, a particular agenda that are worth following. So there's a Weaponized podcast. There's There's Reality Check by Ross Coulthart. There's that UFO podcast. I think there's one called Engaging the Phenomenon. Those folks are typically even keeled and have some good folks on. Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge, right? Like, we haven't really established, I think, the sort of institutions that would help kind of sort out the wheat from the chaff here. So hopefully we're in the process of doing that. Oh, the one I'll mention is the Soul Foundation, which is a think tank that was organized just for UAPs and has folks involved with it that take it very seriously, that bring a very professional and academic orientation to it. So I think you're seeing these emerging, civil society organizations, think tanks, advocacy groups that are trying to collate and drive public policy and academic and professional activities. But you still have, like the UAP subject generates so much emotional and psychic energy that it is sort of rife with a lot of other noise. And that, I think, is what turns a lot of people off, because you quickly Google and you find yourself, with reptilians wearing human skin, and you go down, you can branch into all sorts of different areas. And it says, like, start in the clearing, the well-known, highly confirmed statements on the record, documents, investigative journalism that's well sourced and is very careful. Start there, and don't form any strong conclusions. Like, it took me many years and having like hours and hours and hours of like one-on-one high trust conversations with dozens and dozens of people before I was able to get to the levels of probabilities that you asked me about. So I do not expect the average person listening to form the same levels of credences on these things. I think this is a process that everyone has to go through on their own. But yeah, I think it's about time people start, because I don't know, I wouldn't want to be surprised.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man.